Lie bright, die young. This phrase could not be better suited to describe Billy the Kid. Even though he lived only 21 years, he still managed to leave his mark on history. This guy took part in many shootouts, repeatedly escaped from custody, and generally constantly walked on the edge of a knife. But despite the image of a scoundrel and psychopath that some writers and directors created for him, Billy the Kid was a cheerful guy who always dreamed of a quiet and calm life. Unfortunately, circumstances forced him to act contrary to his desires. William Henry McCarthy, which was Billy the Kid's name, was born on November 23, 1859 in New York. His parents were Patrick McCarthy and Catherine Devine, simple workers. Their life was hard, they had to work from morning to evening to feed William and his brothers. Her father died when Billy was still very young. After the head of the family left this world, Catherine had to work for two in order to somehow make ends meet. But alas, her health failed and the woman fell ill with consumption, that is, tuberculosis. For some time, doctors tried to cure her, but her condition only worsened. When it became clear that life in the humid climate of the city, on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean with such a disease, was completely impossible, Catherine and her children left for the interior of Indianapolis. There she met a pleasant man named Antrim. By the way, in the future it will be her that Billy will use for a couple of her pseudonyms, Keith Antrim and Henry Antrim. As time passed, the family moved to Kansas, and a little later to New Mexico. Mr. Antrim was confident that the dry climate and good treatments would benefit his beloved. However, Catherine died in 1874. Billy didn't want to live with his stepfather, so at the age of 14 he moved to Sarah Brown's boarding house and rented a room there. To pay for their housing, they had to do hard work. Already in September 1875, Billy committed his first crime. He stole food from a local store. However, he was caught in the act and handed over to law enforcement officers. Fortunately, the local sheriff took pity on the guy and released him that same evening, threatening that next time he would throw him behind bars. Finding himself on the street, a hungry young man in cast-offs decided to take the path of reform and found himself a job as a dishwasher at a local hotel. But again, they didn't really pay him any money, and Billy didn't see any prospects even on the horizon. Then a certain boy named George Schaefer appeared in his life. He offered to give Billy the Kid some new clothes and came up with a hapless plan to rob a Chinese laundry. At night, the young men broke into the room and took several bags of clothes, and also grabbed 2 revolvers. When information about the theft reached the sheriff, he quickly realized whose hands it was. Schaefer left town immediately after the theft, but Bill was arrested again. The guy was very scared that this time he would definitely be imprisoned for a long time, and being naturally thin and frail, he easily climbed out through the fireplace through the pipe to the roof and ran away. There was nowhere to go, and therefore Billy the Kid decided to seek help from his stepfather. When they met and the baby told what happened, he heard only one phrase: "If you are like that, get out." From that moment on, Billy the Kid's life changed completely. He realized that he was alone in this world and could not count on anyone's help. After such a shock, Bill stole his stepfather's clothes, as well as his gun, and went nowhere. For a whole year he wandered around Arizona, stealing cattle and horses. He had to learn to survive in this dangerous world, where problems were solved by force. He now carried a pair of revolvers and was excellent with them. But he was still a fragile boy with naive eyes. At the same time, he met John McKee, a criminal who was a former private cavalryman in the service of the U.S. Army. He taught Billy how to better handle horses and how to escape from being chased. By the way, one cannot fail to mention the fact that all this time the kid was trying to find a normal and legal job. That is why he worked part-time at local ranches and carried out various assignments from local entrepreneurs. In general, many people who encountered Billy the Kid noted that he was a very smart, sociable, and pleasant guy who played musical instruments perfectly and never refused help. At that moment, It seemed that Billy the Kid's life was getting better, but alas, fortune turned against him once again. A blacksmith from Cam Grant, Francis Cahill, a man endowed with enormous physical strength, but not very intelligent, decided to make Billy the Kid a whipping boy. In front of a crowd of onlookers, the blacksmith beat the boy, pulled him by the hair, and slapped him in the face with his palms. Anyone else in Billy's place would have shot the scoundrel long ago, but the boy was too peaceful. He endured trying to avoid meeting the bully. He could not leave these places, because he considered it shameful for himself to run away like a beaten dog. However, in August 1877, Billy the Kid and Francis Cahill met again in one of the local salons. The foolish blacksmith had too much alcohol and began to insult the baby, but he did not tolerate it and answered him. Then Francis simply lost his temper, jumped out of his chair and rushed towards Billy, knocked him down, pinned him to the floor and began hitting him in the face. He was beside himself with anger. A little more and he would have crippled the thin boy with his heavy fists, but Billy pulled out his revolver, pressed the toima into his thick belly and pulled the trigger. The big man went on a date with God, and Keith jumped up from the sun, jumped on a horse and rode out of the city. After a short time, he returned back, apparently hoping that the judge would acquit him since it was self-defense, and many witnesses could confirm this, but Miles Wood, that's the name of the judge, decided otherwise. He arrested Billy the Kid and sent him to the lodge at Cam Grant. The young man escaped from there before law enforcement officers arrived. It was dangerous to stay in Arizona, so the young man decided to go to New Mexico. He stole a horse and moved through deserted lands. There the Apache Indians praised him and took away his horse and all his supplies. Apparently, they expected that the guy would die on the way because it is very difficult to survive in such circumstances, but Billy the Kid did the impossible. On the verge of complete exhaustion, he reached Fort Stanton. Fortunately, his old friend John Jones, who was in a gang of Semarek warriors, lived there. He sheltered Billy in his home, and his mother Barbara helped Kid regain his health. After a full recovery, the Kid joined one of the local gangs and, together with new accomplices, stole cattle throughout Lincoln County. This is how Billy earned his living until he got a job as a cowboy on the ranch of a local businessman named John Henry Tunstall. The new job completely suited the young man. But unfortunately, at that moment he did not yet understand that he had gotten involved in a very dangerous game. The thing is that Mr. Tunstall, along with his business partner Alexander McQueen, was in opposition to other businessmen, namely Lowens Murphy, James Dolan, and John Riley. This trio owned a serious business in Lincoln County. This is not at all surprising, since they had contracts with the U.S. government. Moreover, they lured the sheriff, the governor, and even the local prosecutor to their side. Naturally, they were not going to share such power and profit with a businessman who arrived from England, and therefore they made a lot of efforts to throw him out of the game. John Tunstall himself wrote the following to his father at home. Everything that makes money in New Mexico is controlled by one cabal or another. There are Indian, Army, legal, Roman Catholic, cattle breeding, horse stealing and a dozen other cliques. You must either enter one of them or create your own. I'm currently working on creating my own clique. I intend to confine my operations to Lincoln County so that I can get half of every dollar the people here make. At the same time, Tunstall was well aware that his opponents would not sit idly by. Over time, the conflict gained momentum and eventually the Lincoln County War became the largest civil conflict in the Wild West. Most of the residents of the district, in one way or another, sided with one of the warring sides, and Billy the Kid was no exception. In February 1878, Tantalus's partner McSweeney found himself in debt to Dolan. He delayed the return of funds and the latter turned to a sheriff named Brady for help. He seized McQueen's property and gathered a large detachment from his people to take Maxwell's cattle to pay off the debt. Tunstall found out about this and moved to meet Brady's squad. However, there was no peaceful resolution to the conflict. A shootout began, One of the fired bullets hit Mr. Tantalus in the chest and he fell from his horse. After that, one of Brady's thugs finished off the businessman lying on the ground. This crime caused outrage among many residents of Lincoln County. Most of the people who worked or were friends with Tunstall decided to punish the culprits, because they could not turn a blind eye to such lawlessness. Among the dissatisfied was Billy the Kid. He, along with a detachment of Tantalus's supporters, went to Magistrate Wilson and received an arrest warrant for the perpetrators. It should be noted here that Billy became a regulator and acted within the framework of the laws. But alas, fate took a sharp turn again. When the regulator squad arrested Morton and Baker, the very men who shot Tanstila in cold blood, they attempted to escape and were eliminated. After this, Billy the Kid and other regulators went after the corrupt Brady Font. They waylaid him on his way to church. Despite the fact that the rift was accompanied by 4 guards, this did not help him. The regulators opened fire from an ambush and the first shots turned out to be very accurate. Brady and one of his men fell dead. The rest managed to run away, but in fact no one pursued them. The main task of the regulators was completed. By the way, witnesses to the incident claim that it was Billy who hit the sheriff. After 3 days, Keith and his brothers in arms accidentally met Andrew Roberts, another of Brady's men. There were 12 regulators, and Roberts was alone. Initially, everything looked like it wouldn't be difficult to arrest him. But everything turned out differently. Andrew refused to surrender and opened fire on the attackers. He was a good shot and wounded 3 regulators, and killed their leader Dick Brewer on the spot. A few hours later, Billy and his comrades were able to eliminate Andrew, but the battle turned out to be very hot. After this event, Tantalus's colleague McSweeney decided that the scales were tipping in his direction and decided to strike at the top of the opposing side in order to end the war once and for all. He gathered all the regulators and also took a lot of his people. In total, the detachment consisted of about 50 people. With such an army, he rushed to Lincoln and wanted to arrest Dolan. But he gathered his people in time, after which they pushed the regulators and their allies back to McQueen's house. There they took up defensive positions, but with each passing hour the situation became worse and worse. Dolan's thugs received reinforcements from all over Lincoln County, and by the end of the day the advantage was quite significant. They surrounded McSweeney's house and began to fire at it from all sides. At that moment, the businessman's people realized that the blood of a great commander clearly did not flow in their leader's veins. When night fell, most of the fighters left McSweeney, leaving only the regulators who offered stiff resistance to the condemners. The next morning, soldiers under the command of Colonel Dudley arrived in the city. They took with them a howitzer, as well as several Gatling machine guns. But fortunately for Billy Kid and his comrades, they did not engage in battle, but only watched. So another 3 days passed and Dolan realized that he was not able to knock the regulators out of the house. Then he ordered his men to set it on fire. McSweeney panicked and became hysterical. This had a detrimental effect on the exhausted regulators, but fortunately Billy the Kid took control of the squad. His shooters moved around the rooms and fired accurately at the attackers, despite the smoke, fire, and bullets flying past. He realized they had to wait until nightfall before the regulators could back down. And so it happened. As darkness fell, Billy the Kid ordered his men to split into 3 groups and break out under cover of darkness. Fortunately, the besiegers did not expect such insolence from the regulators and the latter managed to leave the city. By the way, in the morning the soldiers counted over 2,000 spent cartridges, and the war in Lincoln County ended. After escaping McSweeney's burning house, the regulators took refuge in the Mexican village of Fort Sumner. Once upon a time there was an army fort on the site of the village, but the soldiers left it long ago. Now Billy had many friends there too, and he spent almost every evening having fun and flirting with black-haired beauties. The new governor of New Mexico, Wallace, declared an amnesty for all county residents who participated in the recent war, hoping that this would help the parties quickly forget previous grievances. It turned out that Billy the Kid, not being a resident of the county, was not included in the amnesty, being considered mercenaries who had no personal interests in the conflict. Now he has too many enemies in the form of representatives of the law and former opponents to feel calm. He decided to come to an agreement with at least one of the parties first, and wrote a letter to Governor Wallace in which he claimed that he was innocent and acted within the law. In a response letter, Wallace said that he was ready to give Billy the Kid a pardon if he came to a personal meeting with him. The guy believed the governor, arrived in the city and was ready to testify against Dolan at the trial. However, everything went wrong. Wallace ordered that no charges be brought against Billy at trial, but the district attorney refused to comply. He accused Kid of murdering Sheriff Brady and sentenced him to death. By the way, Billy was the only one who was convicted for participating in the Lincoln County War. The guy was taken into custody, but he escaped once again and became a criminal who was caught by all the lawmen in the state. Newspapers published numerous articles about the atrocities of the famous bandit, attributing to him almost all the raids, murders and thefts committed in the state of New Mexico. A bounty was placed on Billy the Kid's head, so now not only lawmen, but simple lovers of easy money were hunting for him. The guy escaped pursuit again and again, got into serious firefights and tried to survive in a variety of ways. He also repeatedly wrote to Wallace asking him to sort out the situation, but all his letters remained unanswered. This went on for several months until Sheriff Garrett got on Kid's trail. By the way, the newly appointed sheriff was involved in cattle theft in the past and repeatedly crossed paths with Billy. He understood well how criminals thought and always knew where to look for Kid. In mid-December 1880, the sheriff set up an ambush in the abandoned building of the Fort Summer Military Hospital, and his expectations were justified. At about 8 o'clock in the evening a line of horsemen appeared. The lawyers thought that it was Billy the Kid who was going first. Shots broke the evening silence and the leading rider leaned his chest onto the neck of his horse. It was not Billy who was killed, but Tom Follard, and his friends in the blink of an eye turned their horses and a minute later disappeared into the darkness. Garrett soon tracked down Kid and his associates again. Lawmen blocked the former regulators in a stone house and opened fire. The firefight continued for several hours, after which the besieged realized their situation was hopeless and surrendered. A new trial took place. On it, Billy the Kid was again sentenced to death. However, he again managed to escape from the hands of law enforcement officers, killing 2 guards. And it is worth noting that Kid's escape from Lincoln is covered in legends and is considered one of the most successful in the history of the Wild West. After escaping, Billy returned to Fort Sumner, where he spent several weeks, but Garrett decided to see the matter through. He hid in Kid's bedroom and when he returned home at night, the sheriff fired 2 shots at the guy. One of the fired bullets hit Kid right in the heart, so he died on the spot. Some time later, Garrett wrote the book The True Life of Billy the Kid. There he portrayed the young man as a notorious scoundrel, a thief, and a murderer, and himself as a real hero who saved New Mexico from the devil in the flesh. However, local residents knew the truth and treated Garrett and all his accomplices with contempt. Moreover, Garrett's life was cut short in February 1908, when an unknown person shot Billy the Kid's killer on a deserted road. This is how the people of Lincoln County thanked their hero. Subsequently, many films were made about Billy, books were written, songs were written, and computer games were made. Here's another interesting fact. The first photograph of Billy the Kid went under the hammer for $2 million. The cost of the second is estimated at $5 million. The third photo, which Frank Abrams found, may turn out to be much more expensive than both. Unlike them, it depicts not only the famous bandit, but also the man who killed him.